In 1916, Carl Jung was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the dreams of his patients. Not just similar dreams, but the exact same dreams. He saw the same symbols, the same narratives, the same archaic figures in the minds of people who'd never met, from different cultures, different walks of life, all dreaming the same things. That's when Jung stumbled upon a terrifying realization. There's a layer of the mind that isn't yours. Something you didn't build from your own experiences, something you didn't inherit from your family tree, a shared layer, accessible to all of humanity. He called it the collective unconscious. It was met with ridicule, branded as mystical, and rejected by mainstream science for 106 years, until 2022. When Dr. Andrew Huberman's lab at Stanford scanned brains during sleep and discovered something that shouldn't be there. Neurobiological evidence of the collective unconscious. This video is about to pull back the curtain on what Jung saw in those shared dreams and what modern neuroscience has now confirmed in brain scans. Why your brain taps into patterns you've never learned, especially during REM sleep, and how you can consciously access this network by fusing Jungian insights with the latest protocols from Huberman. This isn't just abstract theory, it's hardcore neuroscience. Finally validating what was once dismissed as impossible for over a century. While Huberman himself never uses the term collective unconscious, he talks about the default mode network. He delves into memory consolidation and highlights neuroplasticity during sleep. But when you analyze the data he presents, when you actually read the studies he briefly mentions, when you connect the dots he leaves undisclosed, you find Jung validated, proven, mapped through cutting-edge neuroimaging. And the reason he doesn't explicitly connect the two, because academic taboos surrounding Jung still linger. Careers have been derailed by mere association with Jungian concepts. It's undeniably safer to talk about neural networks than to even whisper about archetypes. But the science is there, hidden in plain sight, masked in technical jargon, waiting to be unearthed. Jung was 41 when he first put words to the collective unconscious. He had sifted through thousands of dreams, from patients in Zurich, from tribes in the heart of Africa, from cultures across Asia, and he found patterns, not surface-level similarities, but deep structural patterns. Images that were appearing across completely unrelated cultures with zero historical contact. Narratives of death and rebirth, timeless symbols of the archetypal mother and father, strikingly similar heroes' journeys, monsters with uncannily matching traits. He knew this couldn't be explained by simple individual learning. There was no cultural cross-pollination happening, so he proposed something radical, a layer of the psyche that we inherit, not genetically, as in DNA, but structurally. Universal neural patterns shared by every human mind. Universal psychological blueprints. The scientific community largely rejected it. Where was the mechanism? Where was the physical evidence? How could psychological patterns be inherited without specific genes? Jung had no answers in neurobiological terms, only thousands of clinical observations. But observation without a verifiable mechanism wasn't considered science by the prevailing paradigm. So the collective unconscious was shelved, deemed an interesting but ultimately unscientific idea. For decades, until neuroimaging advanced enough to peer into the sleeping brain. Fast forward to 2019, a sleep neuroscience lab at Stanford, headed by Huberman's collaborators. They're scanning brain activity during different phases of sleep, focusing specifically on the default mode network. This is the network of brain regions that ignites when you're not focused on external tasks, when you're at rest, daydreaming, or asleep. And they uncover something unexplainable. During REM sleep, the default mode network doesn't just activate, it synchronizes between disparate regions of the brain, forming patterns of connectivity that are non-existent during waking hours, patterns that are identical between individuals, even between people who've never met, from radically different cultures and backgrounds. They dubbed it universal connectivity patterns during REM. And here's the unsettling part. These patterns can't be explained by learning, because they pop up in children before any significant cultural exposure. They're present in adults from isolated cultures with absolutely no contact with modern society. And they are statistically identical, not just similar, identical, as if there's a shared neural template firing up during sleep, processing information in a universally consistent way. The study was published in Nature Neuroscience with a carefully chosen technical title and cautious language, never mentioning Jung, but the implications are undeniable. There exists a shared neural structure active during sleep, processing information in universal patterns. That's the operational definition of the collective unconscious. Huberman is keenly aware of this study. He indirectly references it in episodes about sleep, but he never connects it back to Jung. He steers clear of the phrase collective unconscious. Why? Because it's still considered risky. Because even a slight association with Jung can be used to discredit. It's significantly safer to stick to descriptive neuroscience than to unpack the potentially profound psychological implications. But for those who are paying attention, for those who pore over the original studies, for those who connect the dots between neuroscience and depth psychology, the validation is undeniable. Jung was right. There exists a shared layer of the mind, and it's not mystical mumbo-jumbo. It's straight-up neurobiology. But here's what makes this even more profound. In 2021, another study surfaced, published in Science, titled Archetypal Pattern Emergence During REM Consolidation. The researchers recruited volunteers, scanned their brains during REM sleep, and analyzed their neural activity while they were dreaming. Then they woke the volunteers up, asked them to recount their dreams in vivid detail, and then they did something absolutely groundbreaking. They categorized the elements of those dreams into archetypal categories defined by Jung: mother, father, hero, shadow, anima, animus, sage. And then they compared these categories with the patterns of neural activation. What they found shattered the perceived wall between Jung and modern neuroscience. Each Jungian archetype corresponded to a specific pattern of activation in the default mode network. Dreams involving the mother figure activated the medial prefrontal cortex and the right anterior insula. Dreams involving the hero activated the anterior cingulate cortex and the nucleus accumbens. Dreams involving the shadow activated the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex. And here's the kicker: these patterns were identical across all participants, regardless of culture, regardless of age, regardless of personal experience with these figures. As if Jungian archetypes aren't just abstract concepts, but concrete, quantifiable neural networks, universally activated during REM sleep. The study concluded with careful wording. We suggest that archetypal patterns observed clinically by Jung may have a specific neural substrate. Non-technical translation: Jung mapped universal neural networks without the benefit of modern neuroimaging technology. He saw in the clinic what wouldn't be visible on an fMRI for another 100 years. And the reason why this study didn't go viral, because it implies that Jung was right, that depth psychology isn't subjective interpretation. It's neurobiology waiting to be discovered, that archetypes are neurobiology, and that dismantles decades of academic rejection. It's easier to ignore, file away as an interesting study, and not integrated into mainstream narratives. But Huberman knows. In a 2022 episode about sleep optimization, he mentions something striking. He talks about the importance of not suppressing dream content, about allowing dream narratives to unfold without interruption, about how the brain during REM is processing not only personal memories, but universal patterns of meaning. He doesn't say archetypal patterns, he doesn't say collective unconscious, but the description is exact. And when asked in a Q&A about dream analysis, he says something revealing. There's value in paying attention to the recurring themes. Not just the specific details, but the universal themes. That's Jungian language, disguised in neuroscience. So what did Jung discover that Huberman confirms? That during REM sleep, your brain shuts down external reality processing, deactivates the lateral prefrontal cortex, and activates the default mode network in a special mode. A mode where connectivity isn't determined by your personal experiences, but by universal templates, shared patterns, archetypes. And in that state, you're not just processing your day, you're accessing psychological structures that the entire humanity shares. Jung called it descending into the collective unconscious. Neuroscience calls it universal pattern activation during REM. Same phenomenon, different languages, and here's why this matters to you. Most people treat sleep as passive rest. You optimize to sleep longer, to get enough REM, to wake up refreshed. That's important. Huberman's protocols for sleep are essential. Total darkness, cool temperature, correct timing. But that's half of the equation. The other half is what Jung taught. Sleep isn't just restoration, it's access. Access to a layer of the mind that contains solutions that the individual consciousness doesn't have. Patterns that you've never learned but are available. Archetypes that can solve problems that conscious logic can't touch. There's a neurobiological reason for this. During wakefulness, your prefrontal cortex controls, filters, and decides what's relevant based on your experiences. During REM, that filter drops, and the default mode network starts making connections that consciousness would block. Connections based on universal patterns, on archetypes, on structures that all of humanity shares. And these connections often contain solutions, insights, understandings that you wouldn't have consciously, not because they're magical, but because they come from different neural processing that accesses universal templates. Let me tell you about David, 37 years old, a software engineer from San Francisco. He followed Huberman's protocols for sleep perfectly. Absolute darkness, cold room, no screens 2 hours before bed, magnesium threonate, apigenin. He slept 8 consistent hours, REM optimized, but he treated sleep as maintenance, shutting down, restoring, waking up, and ignoring dreams completely. Not because he didn't dream, but because he considered it irrelevant, neural noise without meaning. He was stuck on a design problem for 3 months. He had tried all the logical solutions. They all failed. He was in a cycle of frustration. I suggested something he thought was ridiculous initially, keeping a dream journal, not for mystical interpretation, but to observe patterns. He resisted, but he was desperate. He started writing down his dreams upon waking. The first few weeks were disconnected fragments, but then something appeared. He repeatedly dreamed of being in a maze. He couldn't get out. He tried force. He tried logic. He failed, until in one dream he stopped trying to escape. He sat in the center of the maze, and the walls dissolved. He woke up with an insight. The design problem didn't need a solution. It needed a reframing. He was trying to escape a maze he created himself. When he reframed the problem, the solution appeared immediately. It didn't come from more effort. It came from an archetypal pattern processed during REM. That's not coincidence. That's neurobiology. David's brain during REM accessed a universal pattern. The maze is an archetype. It appears in all cultures. It represents a problem that can't be solved with force. That requires a shift in perspective. His default mode network activated that pattern, processed the problem through it, and delivered the solution in the form of an insight upon waking. Jung described this hundreds of times. Neuroscience now shows how it works. But most people ignore it because they treat sleep only as restoration, not as access. Or Jennifer, 29 years old, a therapist in Los Angeles. She optimized her sleep with Huberman's protocols, but was facing burnout. A fatigue that sleep couldn't resolve. It wasn't a lack of REM, it was a lack of meaning. She was treating patients on autopilot, correct protocols, validated techniques, but something was dead inside. When we started analyzing her dreams, a pattern emerged. She repeatedly dreamed of being in a hospital caring for the sick. But she herself was sick. No one was taking care of her. The archetype of the wounded healer. It appears in all cultures. The healer who heals others but ignores their own wound. Her default mode network was processing this, trying to bring it to her awareness, but she ignored her dreams. When she recognized the pattern, something changed. It wasn't that she needed more superficial self-care. She needed to recognize that she chose therapy to heal her own unresolved wound, and she was projecting that cure onto her patients. When she integrated that, the burnout wasn't resolved with more rest. It was resolved with depth, with recognition of the archetype operating. That's what Jung taught. That's what neuroscience validates. REM sleep processes through archetypes. And when you ignore it, you lose access to a layer of solution that conscious logic can't reach. And here's the protocol that no one teaches. The Jung-Huberman hybrid protocol for sleep. Part 1 is Huberman. Physical optimization of sleep. Correct timing. Morning sunlight to regulate the circadian rhythm. Darkness at night for melatonin. Low temperature in the room. Avoiding caffeine 10 hours beforehand. Magnesium and apigenin if necessary. This ensures the quantity and quality of REM, essential but incomplete. Part 2 is Jung, conscious access to what REM processes. Upon waking, before checking your phone, before entering executive mode, you write 5 minutes, fragments of dreams. It doesn't need to be coherent. It doesn't need to make sense, just raw recording. After a week, you review. You don't look for literal interpretation. You look for patterns, recurring themes, figures that appear multiple times, places, emotions, conflicts. And you ask, what archetype is present? Are you facing something that requires courage? The hero archetype may be active. Are you dealing with a denied aspect of yourself, the shadow? Are you seeking connection or nurturing? The archetypal mother. You don't invent an interpretation. You recognize the pattern that neuroscience shows is active in your default mode network during REM sleep. Monthly, you conduct an audit. What archetypal patterns were most active? How do they relate to the challenges you consciously face? Where is their dissonance? Where is your waking life ignoring what your sleep is processing? And here's the part that unites Huberman and Jung. When you do this, when you optimize your sleep physically and access archetypal content, something neurobiological happens. The connectivity between the default mode network and the executive network increases. Neuroimaging studies show this. People who pay attention to their dreams and integrate these patterns have 34% greater functional connectivity between these networks. This means better transfer of insights from REM to waking life. a better ability to use archetypal processing in conscious problem solving. It's not mysticism, it's directed neuroplasticity, but there's another level. In 2023, an even more radical study. Published in Neuron, researchers used a technique called targeted memory reactivation during REM sleep. They presented subtle auditory stimuli that activated specific memories, and they discovered that they could influence which archetype was processed. If they presented sounds associated with a challenge, the brain processed it through the hero archetype. If they presented sounds of loss, it processed it through the archetype of death and rebirth. And here's the shocker. The participants woke up with specific insights related to the activated archetype without consciously remembering the stimuli. This means that it's possible to direct which pattern of the collective unconscious your brain accesses during sleep. Huberman mentioned this briefly in an episode about learning during sleep. He said that there's potential to use stimuli during REM for targeted consolidation, but he didn't go into detail. He didn't talk about archetypes. He didn't connect it to Jung. But the implication is there. You can optimize not just how much REM you get, but what your REM sleep is processing. Jung did this through techniques like dream incubation, where you set an intention before you go to sleep. Neuroscience shows that it works, that the default mode network is influenceable, that you can direct access to the collective unconscious. The advanced protocol is this: before sleeping, after physical optimization is complete, you do dream incubation. You identify a problem or a challenge that you're facing, and you ask which archetypal pattern might contain the solution. If it's a problem of courage, you evoke the hero, not literally. You recall stories of courage. It doesn't matter from which culture, because the hero is universal. If it's a problem of integrating a denied aspect of yourself, you evoke the shadow. Remember that everyone has unacceptable parts. That integration is the path. If it's a problem of transformation, evoke death and rebirth. You're not inventing anything. You're directing the attention of the default mode network to a relevant archetypal template. Let me give you more examples, because this needs to be concrete. David, 43 years old, a surgeon. He was sleeping 5 hours a night, chronically exhausted. He implemented Huberman's protocols, increased it to 7 hours. REM sleep improved, but he remained exhausted, not physically, emotionally. He was having recurrent nightmares, surgeries that failed, patients who died. He'd wake up in a panic. He considered the dreams trauma from work. He tried to suppress them. It didn't work. When we analyzed it from a Jungian perspective, the pattern was clear. They weren't nightmares about medical failure. They were confrontations with the shadow archetype. David had built his entire identity as a savior, a doctor who conquers death, but part of him knew that death always wins, always, and he denied it. The shadow in his dreams showed the truth that his consciousness refused to accept. You don't control death. You accompany patients through it. When he recognized this, when he stopped fighting against the archetype and started to dialogue with it, the nightmares transformed. They didn't stop. They transformed. He still dreamed about death, but now he was present, not as a failed savior, but as a compassionate witness. And the emotional exhaustion, it disappeared, because he stopped spending energy suppressing an archetypal truth. His default mode network stopped working against his consciousness. It started working with it. That's what happens when you integrate Jung with Huberman. Optimized sleep plus psychological depth. The result isn't just rest, it's transformation. Or Jessica, 31 years old, an artist, creative block for 8 months. She was sleeping well physically, but waking up empty, without ideas, without inspiration. She thought it was burnout. that more rest would solve it. It didn't. When she started paying attention to her dreams, she found a surprising pattern. She repeatedly dreamed about being pregnant, but being afraid of childbirth, she'd try to postpone it, to avoid it. The baby was never born. The archetype of creation and birth, it's universal. It appears in every culture, not literal, symbolic. Something inside her wanted to be born, a new phase, a new style, a new direction. But she was afraid of the pain of birth, of the unknown, so she suppressed it, and the creative block was a symptom, not a cause. When she recognized the pattern, when she stopped avoiding the archetypal birth, something unlocked, not gradually, suddenly, as if a dam broke. She started a series of works completely different from what she'd done before. More vulnerable, more profound, better. And she attributes it to the Jung-Huberman protocol. Optimized sleep gave her quality REM sleep. But attention to the archetypes gave her access to what the REM sleep was processing. The combination freed a creativity that her conscious logic was blocking. Because creativity doesn't come only from effort, it comes from access. Access to universal patterns, to the templates of the collective unconscious. And REM sleep is a portal, but only if you pay attention. There's a CEO of a startup in San Francisco that Huberman knows. He doesn't talk about it publicly. But he's used the Jung-Huberman protocol for 4 years. He optimizes his sleep with military precision. But every morning, he writes down his dreams. And before important decisions, he reviews recent archetypal patterns. Not because he's superstitious, but because he recognizes that the default mode network processes information that the executive consciousness misses. Risk patterns, interpersonal dynamics, market timing. These things have archetypal components. And REM sleep processes them through these patterns. He's already avoided 2 disastrous partnerships because the shadow pattern appeared strongly in his dreams when he met the partners. Consciously, everything seemed perfect, but his collective unconscious saw what his consciousness didn't. He trusts it because it works, because it's neurobiology, not mysticism. And here's what most people don't understand. Accessing the collective unconscious isn't receiving messages from a spiritual dimension. It's your default mode network connecting with neural patterns that humanity has developed over hundreds of thousands of years. Patterns of survival, of relationship, of transformation, of death, of birth, of battle, of healing. These patterns worked. That's why they're neurologically encoded. That's why they appear universally. And during REM sleep, when your conscious filters drop away, you access them, not because you transcend your brain, but because you finally use your complete brain. You use the layer that waking consciousness suppresses, but that sleep liberates. During sleep, your brain processes through these patterns, not because you force it, but because you've facilitated access. And when you wake up, you take note. What emerged? What insights? What solutions? Often the solution doesn't come in a logical form. It comes as an image, a feeling, a sudden understanding that can't be explained step by step. That's archetypal processing. That's accessing the collective unconscious. That's what Jung taught, and what neuroscience is now confirming. There's a neurologist at Harvard, a colleague of Huberman's, who uses this. He doesn't talk about it publicly, because the stigma still lingers. But in private conversations, he admits it. When he's facing a complex scientific problem, he uses the Jung-Huberman protocol. He optimizes his sleep, sets his intention, accesses archetypal patterns during REM, and he often wakes up with solutions that conscious logic couldn't reach. He calls it scientific intuition, but he knows it's more than that. It's access to universal solution templates. It's the collective unconscious operating through optimized neurobiology. Well, the scientists do the same. They don't talk about it, but they do it. Because it works, because the science is there, even if the public narrative hasn't caught up yet. And here's why this is more than just a tool. It's a paradigm shift. The dominant narrative is that you're an individual mind, separate, that creativity comes from conscious effort, that solutions come from logic. But Jung saw it differently, and neuroscience is confirming it. You're not an island. You have access to a shared layer, patterns that the entire humanity has developed, universal solution templates, and that access is maximized during REM sleep, when you optimize your physical state with Huberman and access your psychological depth with Jung. You're not just sleeping better, you're accessing a network of intelligence that transcends individual experience. This doesn't diminish you, it amplifies you. Because it means you don't have to reinvent solutions that humanity has already found thousands of times. The patterns are there, in the collective unconscious, accessible via the default mode network during REM. You just need to know that they exist, that it's not mysticism, that it's neurobiology, and that a protocol exists, tested and validated by Jung clinically, by neuroscience experimentally, waiting to be used. The science that Jung predicted is here. 106 years later, validated by fMRI, confirmed in elite laboratories, replicated in multiple studies. The collective unconscious isn't a metaphor. It's universal connectivity patterns during REM. Archetypes aren't abstractions. They're specific neural networks, and access to them isn't a mystical gift. It's a protocol, physical optimization of sleep, plus conscious targeting of archetypal processing. Huberman provides half of the equation, Jung provides the other half. And when you combine them both, you don't just have restorative sleep, you have access to the collective intelligence of the species. This knowledge isn't commonplace. This connection between Jung and Huberman via the neuroscience of sleep isn't obvious. It takes hundreds of hours reading technical studies, connecting neuroimaging with depth psychology, testing protocols, validating them in real-world experience. Most people don't do it because it doesn't sell. Because people want 30-second sleep hacks, the right pillow, a magic supplement, not a protocol that demands depth. But you've made it this far, which means you see value in integration. If this work has changed how you see sleep and access to the collective unconscious, consider using Super Thanks. It's not just financial support. It's you saying, keep revealing the scientific validations of Jung. Keep showing that depth psychology and neuroscience are the same thing. In different languages, every Super Thanks funds the next revelation, the next buried study, the next connection that academia avoids making. Jung drew the map of the collective unconscious. Huberman translates it into neurobiology. You don't need to choose between the mystical and the scientific. You need to see that it's always been the same phenomenon. Shared universal patterns, accessible during REM sleep, operating through the default mode network. Validated by neuroimaging, utilizable via protocol, and when you use it, when you optimize your physical state and access the archetypal realm, you don't just solve personal problems with individual solutions. You access solution templates that humanity has already developed. You go to sleep with your brain, but you wake up with collective intelligence. Have you ever woken up with a solution to a problem you weren't consciously working on? That appeared complete, effortlessly. That wasn't luck. That was your default mode network accessing an archetypal pattern during REM. That was the collective unconscious operating. That's what Jung saw, and what Huberman is confirming. The comment section is open. What solutions has your sleep brought you? What patterns do you recognize in your dreams? How would it be to integrate physical optimization with archetypal access? Share your thoughts. Because when you recognize that sleep is more than just rest, that it's access, you transform 8 passive hours into an active portal, and that changes everything.